I'm going to talk about some low-dimensional approaches for aeroacoustics flows, and what I'm going to be concentrating on is actually not CAA, but this is the session I'm in, and it's going to be mostly experimental, the work I'm going to talk about. So just to give you a little bit of an outline, I'll talk about the objective and define what I mean by low-dimensional approaches, talk about the techniques, stochastic estimation, proper orthogonal decomposition, and some combined methodologies. Then do a couple of examples of applications that we've been working on, mostly concentrating on the Mach 0.6 cavity, and then try and summarize some of the results. So we've seen from definitely Dr. Lille's talk and Dr. Morris's talk, some of the things we can get from computation, the full field, the unsteady flow dynamics, and really what my group is trying to do is to develop tools where we can get this time-dependent phenomena for full field experimental techniques. So, as I said, one could use numerical simulations to try and get the unsteady phenomena, and they've been very successful from that. From the experimental side, there's been the recent development, and Yulu's done a lot of work in this, and Moore and Louise as well, with time-dependent experimental techniques. However, they're still very much at their infancy. To actually get three-dimensional experimental techniques, they just don't exist. The planar techniques are something like 2 kilohertz, maybe 4 kilohertz, and when one starts to get into high-speed flows, that's not time resolved. It still might as well just be 10 hertz if you're going to go 4 kilohertz, because it is just not fast enough. So what we've been developing is low-dimensional techniques. And one can conventionally think of low-dimensional techniques in at least two ways. Models. So by a model, what I mean is you typically use some type of experiment or knowledge-based empirical data set or empirical basis set. You can project that onto Navier-Stokes equations using Guericke methods or many other methods. And from that, what you can do is you can reduce the order of the Navier-Stokes equations, which you'd be solving for every grid point, into some reduced set of equations, maybe a handful, 15, 20 ODEs, which then you can solve, and it simplifies the flows and allows you to get to some time-dependent phenomena, at least of certain phenomena in the flow field. From the experimental point of view, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a couple locations in the flow field and use the information from that to predict what's going on for the full flow field. Okay, so to try and give you a cartoon, so for example, I'm gonna lean heavily on the cavity example. So let's say these blue lines down here can represent what I'm able to sample the surface pressure on the bottom of the cavity from. These red lines right here might represent when I get my PIV data, and it's effectively a random snapshot. So what I want to try and do is from the few locations where I get this time information, this temporally resolved information, estimate what's going on in the rest of the flow field. So basically we need to fill in the gaps, and the technique that I've chosen to use is stochastically estimating the full velocity field from the surface pressure. So stochastic estimation is just a conditional average, and originally it was written in terms of just the velocity field. However, what we've reformulated, so this U tilde is the estimated velocity field, and we want to estimate it knowing information about how the surface pressure P relates to the velocity. So there's been work since the late 90s where we've started to, instead of using information about the velocity, information about the pressure to represent that, go through the expansion, and you come up with this equation where one could look at linear estimates, quadratic estimates, and so for higher nonlinear estimates. When you go through this, it's just a minimization process to get the coefficients. And basically, what one's trying to do is to solve this equation down here. So these coefficients, AK and BLM, are coefficients that are determined by a priori information, statistical information, about how the surface pressure relates to the velocity field. So when one goes through that, one solves for these coefficients like this, and they have, as I said, they have information about how the pressure field relates to the velocity, as well as how the pressure measurements relate to each other. So one can pose many questions, but the first ones that we wanted to look at was, first of all, how many pressure sensors are needed to actually estimate this and sort of get to the point where you're sort of beating a non-uniqueness problem there. Where should the measurements be, depending upon what phenomena, how well it correlates with the surface pressure measurements, or what you need to do. Do you need to use that first nonlinear, that quadratic term, to try and do the estimate? And how well does the estimate work? So for a standard of comparison, we actually, the guys at Craft, Raj, who's not here, and Srini, Jadison, gave us access to a Mach 1.5 flow, an L over D of 6 cavity under a Mach 1.5 flow. So what this allows us to do is actually evaluate the technique, because by using it with a numerical simulation, we actually have time-resolved information, and we could see how well the technique worked before we started to evaluate experimental data sets where we can't get it. Okay, so what I have here is, this is several time snapshots of the flow field. This is from the simulation. This is a linear estimate, so again, just using the first term in that expansion. This is a quadratic estimate. And these are contours of span-wise vorticity. And one of the things you can see is that the quadratic term actually does add a lot into the vorticity. And if you look back at it, the quadratic term tends to be more of a large-scale term. So when one just uses this linear estimate, actually from the surface pressure, what one gets is just a wave going up and down. There's actually none of the processes, the roll-up that the vortical structures go to. And you need to actually include at least the first nonlinear, the quadratic term, to do that. When my student went through an extensive data set trying to figure out where one should actually measure the pressure along the bottom to try and estimate the vorticity field the best there. And after about a year, we just determined that evenly spaced points across the bottom are the best. The other thing that the quadratic does, which I didn't point out that from here, is that when one looks at the reconstruction of the mean turbulent properties, by including that quadratic term, you actually get better estimates of the velocity field far away from where you're estimating. So the inflow conditions actually were not predicted well by at least the turbulence properties and the inflow conditions were not predicted well by a linear estimate. You actually had to go to the quadratic estimate to get that. Okay, so that's one way of estimating it. It still gives you too much information, and Phil alluded to this. When you have this huge database, what do you want to look at in that database? So now what we're proposing to do is to actually combine this estimation procedure with the proper orthogonal decomposition. And the proper orthogonal decomposition was introduced by Lumley, but basically one solves this integral eigenvalue problem here, where you have some two-point statistics of the flow field as your kernel for this Fredholm equation, and what you get out are these lambdas and phis, where the lambdas are the weights of your individual modes that you're decomposing it to, and these phis sort of represent the structure of the flow field. These are the basis set, an orthogonal basis set of the flow field. One of the nice things about since the properties of the two-point statistics follow certain properties, one can actually reconstruct the instantaneous velocity field, or whatever the field is that you're using to decompose, as the summation of these expansion coefficients times the orthogonal basis set, where the expansion coefficients are found by integrating out over the whole domain, which you're applying the POD over. But it's these expansion coefficients which carry all the time dependence of the flow field. So they are sort of the weighting functions, or the building blocks of the flow field, whereas these carry the spatial information. So when you combine the two techniques, what we're going to try and do is we're going to estimate the time dependence of these POD expansion coefficients, writing it in a similar formula to what I had for the stochastic estimation, knowing information about how the pressure relates to these expansion coefficients. You expand it out and you solve for the coefficients, and basically we can reconstruct the velocity field in these cases as a function of POD modes and the time dependence. I should point out the difference between these two techniques. When you apply the stochastic estimation directly, you're actually solving for the velocity at each grid point in there independently. So you come up with a set of coefficients for your stochastic estimation expansion for each grid point. So it's quite an intensive property, and you could locally do good in one place and not do good in another place because it's all based on how the correlations work. Here what we're doing is we're actually we're correlating the surface pressure with this expansion coefficient, which again is an integral property of the whole flow field. So we're only calculating a set of coefficients for each of the given POD modes here, which is effectively what it says there. Okay, so now to talk about the experiments that were conducted. They were conducted in our 2-inch facility at the University of Mississippi. Jack presented the facility a little bit earlier. Basically what we have the ability to do is to screw off our nozzle system and screw on this 2-inch flow duct. It has right now it has glass on 3 sides, so we can look in from the edge, from the 2 sides. The laser sheet will come in from the top. I'll show that in a second. The nozzle blocks are interchangeable, so we can run supersonic conditions. This is just a model of the solid model of the cavity. The pressure sensors are embedded in there at these locations going across the cavity, so we actually had 10 pressure transducers in there. One of the other things that one always has to be extremely careful about cavities in small experimental facilities is we actually had to build a flow liner for the top of the cavity, top surface of the wind tunnel. It's very easy in cavity flows to set up a resonance in your wind tunnel. And many people end up studying the resonance of the wind tunnel versus the modes of the cavity. Okay, so just details of the PIV. We're using a Nigbiac laser. Comes in through the top. It's shining just slightly offset of the pressure transducers. We really didn't want to blast them with the laser. And what we did is, as we digitized the pressure signal, we were also digitizing the laser signal. So we were able to line up in time, the exact time when the laser was firing, so we could actually begin to correlate the velocity and the pressure. So just in general, nobody's talked about cavities yet. Basically, we have an inflow condition, an inflow boundary layer, some free stream, which for this case is Mach 0.6. We have the shear layer growing here. It interacts with the aft wall, which under given conditions, which could be a function of Mach number, length to depth ratio, the incoming boundary layer to depth ratio, the momentum thickness, the volume, temperature, can set up this resonant phenomena, which one can go back to Rossiter's work and predict the resonant tones. And you can study, these are effectively the relevant parameters. Okay, so just some mean flow properties of the PIV measurements. These are just some mean flow streamlines. You can see the recirculation region in there, the U prime, V prime, and UV prime. This peaks out, I'm sorry, I didn't put the levels on there. That peaks out about 30%. That's about 20% for that. These are the pressure measurements from various locations across the cavity. This black one's on the aft wall, while this blue one down here, or cyan, which is hard to see, is actually on the front wall of the cavity, and it's a cavity exhibiting strong resonance tones. One can clearly, this is the first Rossiter mode, second, and the third seems to be split a little bit as you go down there, but it's a cavity flow dominated by the second Rossiter mode. Okay, so taking all the PIV, we took 1,065 independent snapshots. We can take that, we can apply the POD to that, and this just shows the convergence of the POD. The first mode, or the dominant mode, and I should have mentioned this when you, about the POD, is that it's optimal in the mean square sense, meaning that its convergence is the most rapid convergence in terms of mean square, or here in terms of kinetic energy, or turbulent kinetic energy, that one can decompose the flow into. So like I said, there's 13% about in the first mode, and about 90% of the energy within the first 20 modes. So Just to give you a little bit of insight into what the modes look like. These are modes associated with the streamwise velocity. That's mode 1, 2, 3, and so forth, up to mode 12. You can see the first mode is really associated just with the global shear layer. It's a little more intuitive to actually look at the wall normal velocity modes. So if you think about vortical structures across there, one would expect some type of change in sign in the wall normal velocity as you cross one of those structures. So if you look, again, the first mode is a lot what's happening on the aft wall. If you look at, for example, the second, third, and fourth modes, there's basically some type of double structure in there, which might be associated actually with a second Rossiter mode. With a second Rossiter mode, you might expect to see two structures in there. When you look at, for example, 6, 7, and 8, they tend to be more associated with three structures in there, which might be a third Rossiter mode. And so the POD modes are actually fairly representative of the vortical structure one might expect to find in that flow field. This is just showing you the correlations that are used to extract the coefficient. So again, I'm correlating the POD random coefficient, which again is a function of time, with the surface pressure across there. So on this axis is tau, so that's my time lag that I'm looking at. On this axis is the pressure location. So when you see things like this, and I should point out this is the first, second, the numbers up here represent which POD mode I'm looking at. So when you see stuff like this coming across sensors, it's actually showing some type of convection between the pressure, the correlation between the pressure and the expansion coefficient. And if you actually take the angles of these and look at them in terms of convection velocity, it's nominally 0.6 of the free stream velocity. So it is representative of the convection that one would expect of the structures going through there. Just to try and evaluate the estimation, this is the mean properties, the U prime and the V prime. And here you can see that it peaks out about 10% and about 6% or 8%. We're under predicting the actual levels of the turbulent kinetic energy from this. But if you look at the instantaneous velocity field, there's features in it you can see that you predict very well. You have this large outflow here, which is predicted outflow here. There's just one, this is just some random snapshot that we chose. This large inflow here, or downflow there. And you get many of the features, although the amplitudes are a little bit under predicted. So if we try and look at an animation, so this is now resolved at 30 kilohertz, the rate which we were resolving the pressure signatures. The color contours are span-wise vorticity, and you can see the velocity vectors, and this is using 90% of the energy. So we're using a lot of modes here, so one would expect there to be a lot of complicated phenomena in there. And you see some evidence of certain features. So for example, if I just pull out 9 snapshots, so these are again time resolved at 30 kilohertz, and they go this way. And what you can see is you can see the shear layer, you can see a structure begin to roll up, convect downstream, and then interact with the aft wall. So in terms of the time dependence that we're getting of the say full flow field, or 90% of the energy, we get representative features of the flow field. So now, if you recall, when I talked about that second, third, and fourth POD mode, they were very representative of what I was saying, the second Rossiter mode. So if I just do a reconstruction using these, one sees phenomena associated with that. You see the roll up, you see the structure being convected down, and the second one being structured down. And it gives me a way of actually just looking at the velocity field associated with the second Rossiter mode. I should point out these black symbols down here represent the pressure signatures which I'm using to estimate the rest of the velocity field. And if you remember from the first one, I had 2 more down here, but as experiments go, those are the 2 that would go first. Okay, so just pulling out some of the time-dependent Again, the flow going, or the time going this way at 30 kilohertz. Two things that you see here that are very interesting is you do see this interaction of the vorticity of this vortical structure with the aft wall. You also see the mean flow coming in and crashing into the aft wall, which if you go back in the cavity literature, there is at least some discrepancy of whether it actually is the vortical structure interacting with the aft wall that sets up the resonant, or whether it's actually the force associated with the mean flow streamlines coming down and interacting with the aft wall. And we can try and study that from a technique like this. This is using higher order modes, 6, 7, and 8. And again, here you see phenomena associated with a lot more, possibly 3 structures across there. As you get into the higher POD modes, things tend to get a little messier. But from using this technique, it allows us to decompose the flow and look at the time dependence of different phenomena associated with that. Okay, so I'm going to completely change modes and talk about another application of a very similar technique, which we've been doing in an anechoic jet facility. What we've been able to do is this is done, I should point out, with Mark Glouser and Charles Tinney at Syracuse University. And in this facility, we have a PIV system set up where we're taking cross-plane measurements, so the flow coming through the plane of the PIV measurements. We're measuring the far field simultaneously, as well as some lip pressure, or pressure near the lip. So to give you a better idea of what we're doing here, what we have is we have 15 pressure transducers azimuthally. They're about 1 diameter downstream and about 1 diameter away from the edge of the shear layer at that point. And so we're sampling those simultaneously, and then what we did is we built up a database of the PIV snapshots throughout the sound producing region from 3 to 8 diameters downstream at about a 1/4 diameter increments. The PIV and the near field pressure are sampled simultaneously, and then we're going to perform this estimation to get pictures of what the whole time dependence of this volume of flow field is between 3 and 8 diameters downstream. This is a little busy, but just to show you that what we're picking up with these pressure transducers at the nozzle lip are fairly correlated with the events going downstream. So, for example, red is the correlation between the pressure transducers and measuring the velocity at 1 diameter downstream, and so forth. So what you can see here is, for example, this black one right here is at 3 diameters downstream. The green one, which I can't see, so I assume nobody else can, is at 4 diameters downstream, which peaks around here. So you see the correlation showing peaks of this structure that passes by going downstream further and further. So there is good correlation between what's going on in the flow field and what these sensors are grabbing. So this is actually, these results are last week, so we haven't done too much with them, but this gives an idea. So this is at one time, and this is estimated at a delta T later, and the delta T is based on what the pressure transducer signature is. And these are just planar pictures of the fluctuating velocity field at 3, 3.5, between 8 diameters downstream, and at the next time downstream, at the next delta T. Some of the things you can see is definitely before the end of the potential core, you see this much richer azimuthal structure, a flow dominated by perhaps azimuthal mode 5, mode 6. As the potential core closes out, the flow actually becomes dominated by a much lower azimuthal mode number 2. This is stuff that's been seen in subsonic jets, and it's still dominant. This evolution of this azimuthal, the dominant azimuthal structure evolves, and so where we really want to go with this is to actually, now we have a data set. Okay, so we have a time-dependent data set of this volume of flow field in I didn't point this out, but it's a Reynolds number of about 1 million jet. So it's a 2-inch nozzle running at Mach 0.85. So now we can take some of the techniques that Sanjeeva and his students have developed and actually use this data set instead of their numerical data set to actually plug into Lighthill analogies and Fox-William-Hawkins analogies and start to evaluate if the phenomena that they see in the numerical simulations, which are at lower Reynolds numbers, are still the phenomena associated with the noise generation process at these higher Reynolds numbers. So to summarize, we've used these low-dimensional techniques to estimate the flow field. With the combined POD QSE, I can decompose the flow field down and only look at, for example, in the cavity, I could look at the dynamics of the second Rossiter mode or the third Rossiter mode by decomposing it that way. One of the things that I sort of glossed over, when you looked at those correlations, the correlations between the pressure and the POD expansion coefficient, there was tau on that axis. In the estimation that I'm using right now, I'm just taking it for a single tau. Okay, so what one needs to actually do, and you can see that the correlation was definitely a function of time lag. What one needs to do is actually re-represent the whole problem in spectral space and actually estimate it in Fourier space, which will allow you to actually include all frequencies, hence including all time lags, and actually increase the estimation. And pretty much I've said the other things that are written there.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, let's have a couple of questions.
Yeah, Mr. Paul is from Boeing Company. It was not clear, the PIV data that you took,
Mm-hmm.
what is the rep rate on that?
The rep rate on that is roughly 10 hertz.
10 hertz.
Yes.
But your calculations are 30 kilohertz.
My calculations are 30 kilohertz, which is the resolution of the pressure transducers.
Okay.
So the only thing that the PIV gives me is statistical information between how the pressure relates to the velocity field. Then when I go back and so when I go back into, for example, the PIV is used to calculate these coefficients right here.
Okay.
Okay? And
So
then
the
when I
time
go and I
information-
solve this equation, these coefficients get plugged into here. My time dependence only comes from the pressure terms.
So you're using the time information in the PIV.
I'm not
You're not using it.
I'm not using the PIV is simply used to tell me how the pressure relates to the velocity field in a statistical sense.
So I was a little bit confused on the frequencies. Thank you.
Maybe one last question, John.
Larry, the interesting part about using the pressure field is obviously as you get away from if you're working with, say, just the velocity field and trying to estimate, you're limited to the fact that you have maybe coherence lengths that you're limited to, and the pressure field has a much further persistence. How large were your correlations when you went to 8 diameters downstream with those pressures at the nozzle lips? I wasn't sure if I could read them all.
The coefficient's on the order of about 0.2.
0.2.
So the coefficients, it's not huge, but if you look at where the noise floor was on that plot, noise floor was very low.
Much lower.
Much lower. There was a significant peak in there that you could pick out.
Yeah, no, that's...
So,
that's
you know, when you talk about coefficients, you have to talk about it relatively. One says 0.2 is pretty low, but compared to everything else, it's a distinct peak at the convection velocity, which you would expect to see the structures going by. So,
I know the data is new. Any idea of how much the error increases as you go compared to the closer to the nozzle exit in your estimations?
on that, not yet. Like the student's actually presenting it at Reno next week. But yeah, so
I'll expect to see it then, okay?
Okay, thanks, Larry.